name is Otaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. This is the 18th of a series of short videos dealing with subjects covered in my recent book, Climbing a High Ladder: Development in the Global Economy. Today, we approach why and how to bridge global private finance and green infrastructure investments in developing countries. A massive $81 trillion in infrastructure investments is needed through 2040. The world faces such a huge shortage of infrastructure investments relative to its needs. With few exceptions, such as China, this shortage is even greater in non-advanced economies. The G20 Infrastructure Investors Dialogue estimated those $81 trillion as the volume of global infrastructure investment needs until 2040, and notes that $53 trillion of those in non-advanced countries. The dialogue projected a gap, that is to say, a shortfall in relation to the investments foreseen today, of around $15 trillion in the world, $10 trillion of which in non-advanced economies. The World Bank, in turn, made another estimate regarding the needs of annual infrastructure investments in emerging markets and developing economies for them to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been established for 2030. And those infrastructure investment needs, according to the World Bank, would have to correspond to something close to 4.5% of their annual GDPs. And most of them have not been investing in those figures. In addition to the need for investments in infrastructure, there is a need for its greening as fast and extensively as possible in order to minimize the negative carbon contributions to global warming. Decarbonize the energy sector by expanding the use of renewable source instead of coal. Increasing use efficiency and the elimination of subsidies for the use of fossil fuels would be part of that agenda. Transport is now responsible for 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The load must be shifted to low carbon options, in addition to investments in energy efficient equipment and supporting the transition to electric vehicles and fleets. An important part of the greening will be in cities, improved water supply and sanitation service, as well as changes in energy supply, waste recycling, and greater energy efficiency through better building standards and/or renovation of existing buildings. The transition in cities, as in the case of manufacturing and agricultural activities, will require investments in infrastructure. But a major obstacle to that for such investments comes from the increase in debt, public debt all over the world. That's a major obstacle because there is lack of fiscal space for public spending, including in infrastructure. A problem that was made worse by the fiscal packages adopted because of the pandemic. And while the largest advanced economies can afford to increase their public debt with a low risk of facing deteriorating financial conditions, like the package pushed for by President Biden in the US, that does not apply to most emerging markets, let alone low-income countries grappling with debt on unsustainable routes. Now, it clearly follows that from there, the convenience of increasing the skin of private investors in the game. And indeed, the bridges must be built so as to expand the presence of private financing to infrastructure projects. And according to data from the Institute of International Finance, depicted in this chart, Over the past 15 years, institutional investors with long-time profiles in their assets, such as pension funds, have been gradually increasing their allocations to infrastructure investments and alternatives to fixed income instruments, equity, and other traditional instruments. And that follows, obviously, uh, uh, from the tendency of the world, the advanced economies dealing with declining long-term real interest rates, as depicted in this chart. And see, stable and long-term returns from infrastructure projects dovetail well with the long-term commitments of those financial institutions that we are referring to, particularly in this context of declining long-term real interest rates on both public and private bonds. And this has been for recent decades, and even if there is an eventual change of monetary policy direction in advanced economies, uh, the long-term real interest rates will not tend to go back to the high levels of before. And indeed, according to surveys carried out by the platform Prekin and reported by the IIF, fund managers are already point to uh, energy decarbonization as a potential driver of private infrastructure investments. In the proportion of respondents to a survey, they showed clearly how they strongly believe that decarbonization of energy generation is a must-go for private investments. On the other hand, and also take into account, as I said, how dire is the need at the margin in the side of emerging markets. If we are really to move ahead with the agenda of decarbonizing and greening infrastructure in the planet. And there lies the biggest challenge, that is to say, to extend the bridge between, on the one hand, infrastructure investments in non-advanced countries, and on the other, the private source of finance abundant in dollars and other convertible currencies, with few opportunities to obtain returns compatible with their requirements on their liability side. Building such a bridge requires the fulfillment of two tasks. First, the development of properly structured projects with risks and returns in line with the preferences of the different types of financial intermediation. That would help to close the private financing gap in infrastructure. Because indeed, investors come from different mandates and competencies regarding the management of risks associated with types of projects and phase of investment project cycles. This chart displays the differentiated types of risks faced by those stakeholders along distinctive stages of infrastructure projects. There must be sufficient comfort with managing such risks in order to have their corresponding participation. They demand coverage of risks whose exposure is not adequate or permitted by regulation. The absence of complementary instruments or investors is one of the most frequently identified causes of failure in the financial completion of projects. And the scarce fiscal space in non-advanced economies should be used in a way such as to mainly cover such risks and enable the building up of investment rather than replacing private investments, crowding in private finance instead of crowding them out. National and multilateral development banks could favor this kind of action instead of financing total investments. And the chart illustrates some examples of very dedicated risk coverage that may allow the joining in by private investors and to have a bigger building in terms of private participation. And indeed, look, defining the attractive investment opportunities for different types of investors and combining those perspectives more systematically around specific projects or asset pools is a promising way to fill the infrastructure financing gap. The planning and integrated issuance with different time profiles of fixed income securities, bank loans, credit insurance, and others for the different moments from project preparation to operation make that combination possible. Well, there is also a second task, which concerns the reduction of legal, regulatory, and political risks. Transparency and harmonization of rules and standards can increase the scale of comparable projects and make it possible to build project portfolios. See, several surveys showed clearly how non-banking financial institutions often highlight the absence of ample project portfolios as a disincentive for setting up business lines focused on the area. This is a particularly sensitive point in the case of smaller countries. So, in a nutshell, we face tightness of fiscal space for infrastructure investment, particularly relative to the investment needs. There is, at the same time, this mismatch between the availability of low-cost finance and the scarcity of infrastructure investments, particularly in the case of non-advanced economies. So we have to devise strategies to crowd in private investments rather than crowding them out. And the profile of risks along project stages and the mismatch between risks and comfort to manage them can be addressed by a specific point participation of public sectors or development banks. One needs to deal with the heterogeneity of project standards and of regulatory frameworks in order to be able to build pipelines. Only with those pipelines, the infrastructure investment in emerging markets and development economies as an asset class might be boosted. And also, of course, the green infrastructure investments constitute special pipelines. The contrast between the scarcity of investments in infrastructure, particularly in non-advanced economies, and the excess of savings invested in liquid and low return assets in the global economy deserves to be confronted. Greening infrastructure in non-advanced economies would benefit from being able to attract greenbacks into the business. We will find a discussion on bridging private finance and infrastructure investments in chapter 8 of my book that you can find on those places on the slide. In the next video, we approach the connections between gender equality and economic development. Stay tuned.